All right, fasten your seatbelts. Here we go. Cool. Let's start off with some hard ones. Let's start off with your name, your pronouns, and your indigenous nation.
Okay, my name is Robert Boyce Caldwell Jr. He, his, and I'm from the Choctaw Apache community of Ebar, Louisiana. And yeah.
Oh no, go for it.
Well, right now, this very moment, I'm at my partner and my farmstead in the Arkansas Ozarks, where we have some goats and chickens and turkeys and other animal friends. I was born in Shreveport, Louisiana, and I lived most of my life in Northwest Louisiana. I've also lived in Western Mass for a couple of years, Prague for a year, 2 stints in Bolbancha, totaling probably about 7 years, and Dallas for nearly 6 years. I just finished a 9-month residency in the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, and like I said, I'm in the Ozarks right now, probably for another month before I head to Western Mass to teach some classes at Hampshire.
Yeah. So you kind of gave us a good overview. Can you kind of string it together a little bit and kind of tell us a quick version of your life story?
Okay, yeah, so my life story, well, so I was born in Northwest Louisiana and spent most of my childhood in Bossier City in the shadow of Barksdale Air Force Base. It's a major Air Force installation. And, you know, there's something about major military installations being places of multiculturalism, right? I mean, it's kind of the flip side of that imperialism, the imperialism of a country like the United States going abroad and having some unintended consequences. So I grew up in a very multicultural sort of environment. Lots of Asian kids, African American, white kids from the north, a couple of natives too, and but I didn't really have a sense of my indigeneity. I didn't really have a close sense of my relationship to my tribe, other than to my great grandparents, who I would often visit. And yeah, their lives were so much different than mine. I couldn't help but notice that difference. It was they lived in a rural area. I lived in what I thought was a city, pretty substantial town. Had air conditioning and indoor plumbing, and they didn't. Things like that. And they ate different foods than me and my dad's family for sure. So I always noted that. But aside from my relationship to my great grandparents, I didn't really have much of a sense of, who I was as a Native person as a kid. And I feel like that's something I've grown into over time. And I just often wish that my great grandparents were still alive, because they probably carried so much knowledge to the graves, and I missed them a lot. So when I started doing research into my personal identity and into foodways and other things, I often did that with the close knowledge that my great grandparents really were the teachers. They were the last generation of teachers of anything that we might call like traditional in my family, in my tribe. And luckily, my mom picked up a lot of that with seed saving and with her knowledge of the plants that she got from that. But I would say, like, my my childhood, my early childhood until my teens at least, was something like yeah, just average everyday kid uh, with little sense of uh, of culture other than sort of dominant culture. Yeah.
Um, what was the moment when you were growing up? You said that you didn't have this sense of like indigenous was not part of your personal identity as a child.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about when that happened and how?
Oh yeah, I would say, like, despite, growing up in a very multicultural sort of environment in Bossier, in the shadow of that Air Force base, as kids moved from the single digits to the double digits in years, I think kids started pairing off, and often that was around ethnicity or race. There, and I felt very betwixt in between. I had friends of all races, and I kind of thought that was ridiculous, and I think it really forced me to grapple with, who am I? Um, and also, having a dad who's, one of the most awesome possible um, redneck white people, um, also forced me to think a lot about that. My dad's a great guy. He grew up in a very rural part of Northwest Louisiana. Um, and, that kind of working class white red dirt experience, quite different than what my mom was coming from, and especially what my grandparents and great grandparents were coming from. So it forced me to think a lot about, who am I, and do I identify as, one of these groups or another? And I don't know, I had a lot of angst, and I think I channeled that angst a lot through punk rock. Through my uh, mid-teen years, I organized punk rock shows in Shreveport, Bossier area. I was uh, wannabe kind of producer. Uh, I had a zine, a fanzine I came up with, and yeah, and so I spent a lot of my I took a lot of those questions about identity um, and culture, and what I consider to be a sort of throwaway culture of yeah, mass marketing, ca- consumer capitalism, etc. And I channeled that a lot through punk rock. And yeah, I guess luckily through that time, I had a couple of friends who were also native, but they were far more in touch with their culture, but they didn't necessarily try to share it. I also had a really close friend whose dad uh, was a black uh, masking Mardi Gras Indian, and he always tried to talk culture stuff to me. I wasn't really interested in my native culture so much, but he always tried to push me along that path. And so that I think in retrospect, that's an interesting facet. So that was kind of my teen years. By the time I graduated high school, um, I knew much more about my sort of identity, in the sense that my mother had tried to recapture the teachings that she learned uh, earlier in life, and she made sure that me and the rest of my brother and my sister, that we got enrolled. And I kind of saw myself as being, yeah, as being politically aligned with the aspirations of my tribe, even though I didn't grow up in the culture, if you will. Um, I thought that, it was important to push forward on issues of federal acknowledgement and any other rights that my tribe wanted to assert and defend. And so, um, but it was still sort of, yeah, very sort of arm's length and postage stamp. I would send money to the um, when I had extra money, I would send money to the land fund. So to try and build a larger collective land base, things like that. But it really, it really wasn't. And I had some interest. I went to powwows occasionally, but didn't really see them as being representative of our culture. And I felt as though, because our culture is very much a Métis culture, mestizo culture, I felt like, that many people who embraced their indigeneity amongst my tribe really were willing to ignore or throw away our existing culture, for powwow culture, and that made me, I don't know, pained. But again, I didn't grow up in the culture, so um, maybe it allowed me to see that there was some other culture there, right? Besides this powwow culture. But um, I think overall, um, I became more and more interested and did some things here and there, um, and also started exploring my own identity more. I attended meetings when I went to that University of New Orleans in Bulbancha. Um, there was no American Indian student group, but I joined the Progressive Black Student Union because they were supportive of me, and I felt I should be supportive of them. And um, I would say, I continue to see myself as a member of the tribe and learn more about culture, but wasn't really the my main activities, right? Like I did other kinds of political organizing, and not around identity-based stuff, maybe about, you know, class-based stuff or whatever. Um, and then, after I finished my first master's degree, I moved back to Volbancha, and um, after Hurricane Katrina, I found myself living in North Louisiana again for the first time in years, and coping with the stress and strain um, of the hurricane. I tried to return and make a life there, but um, there's a lot of unhealthy stuff going on. Lots of newcomers trying to help in the city, and also other newcomers trying to, yeah, find great, awesome places at low prices or something. And a lot of my friends who lived in the city before, including myself, experienced a lot of turmoil, a lot of psychological turmoil and pain. And so I would say about 2009, I returned. I think I finally decided to move away from Bobancha, and I returned to North Louisiana. And I started this project in heritage resources, and I wanted to do something with my tribe. So initially, I wanted to do something around identity, and people were less interested in identity. I started going through a lot of papers from outsiders who come to the community, Mennonite volunteers, anthropologists, and others. And some interviews with my great grandparents seemed to have a lot about food, foodways. And so I sort of riffed off that and looked into the food. And I thought, yeah, when I was young, I came to the community a lot and visited my great grandparents, and there were food like, you know, squirrel, especially like squirrel brains or something, something I was just totally grossed out by as a kid. And when I came back around, I looked around and I saw that, yeah, many of these foods were still on the table with some of the older people, but many of them they would say, oh, well, yeah, we used to make that, but it takes long time to prepare, or we no longer grow X, Y, or Z thing, or, you know, this, this, this thing used to grow along the creek beds, but, no longer does it, things like that. And so, um, I thought, if nothing else, I can try and, do an index or some kind of thing on traditional foodways. And I took that sort of idea, and my goal was to make poster panel presentations for a little museum display. There was an idea that my tribe would build a cultural center, and so I thought, oh, here's a display ready to go. And by the time I finished my master's degree, I realized that cultural center wasn't going to come into being, and so I revamped that into a book and worked some more with people in the community to try and fix my mistakes, in my original research, and presented it to the community, and revised it from there. And so that turned into Choctaw Apache Foodways. So I don't know if that fits. That's one story of my life. I could probably tell a million different ones. Depends on the vantage point.
How did you get from the book to the goat farm?
How did I get my
I'm sorry,
what?
how did you get from the book Choctaw Apache Foodways to the goat farm?
Oh, to the goat farm. Yeah, I've been interested in farming for all my life. I had ancestors on my dad's side as farmers, as well as my great grandfather. He was a bit of a farmer. I think he mostly worked logging for most of his life, but he always um, had some sugar cane for the kids, have something sweet to munch on. He always grew corn, had peas, and maybe a couple of pigs and things like that. And um, the goats are interesting because some of the first Europeans that came to the area where my tribe is brought goats and sheep, as well as cattle and pigs. And I think my native ancestors worked with them, so it's an interesting thing. I looked at a lot at Spanish civil censuses and church censuses, and I kept running across this descriptor of some of our ancestors. It says Apache Vaquero, so like Apache cowboys. So a lot of both our Choctaw and Apache and Hadaya ancestors worked with these kind of small stock animals, as well as cattle. So that probably just reinforces, the fact that I think goats are super cute.
So there's a few things that I'm hearing are topics that are coming back up. One of those is, foodways are like your relationship with that and the importance of that to you. Your mother's life, you were talking about that your mother grew up so differently than your father. I'm also hearing about punk rock and
Yes.
powwows, and how those two things were very influential. And then I also heard that you said that there's, when you moved back from Katrina, you felt like there was a bunch of unhealthy habits within your area. I was wondering if any of those sparked your interest, or do you want to talk more about any of those?
Oh yeah, well, the unhealthy habits, I didn't quite get to that, but I meant, in Bovancha after the storm, like people had a lot of coping to deal with, and a lot of trauma. I evacuated in the last day of evacuation, so I didn't have to bear the worst of the storm, but some of my neighbors did. And And so, yeah, like probably by 2008 or 9, I just saw a lot of my friends from before the storm, like uh, delving into worse depression. And sometimes that was accompanied by, self-medication through drugs or alcohol. And I just hated to see it. I hated to see some of them die, like overdose, or one person felt like they needed to shoot and kill someone in self-defense when they were getting mugged. And so, that's, it happens, tragedies happen, but it was like this hurricane kept spinning more and more tragedies out, even months and years after the storm itself was gone, and even on top of structural problems, right? Like, whatever you want to call it, disaster capitalism and the post Katrina sort of, you know, real estate developer sort of boom. Even on top of all that, there just kept being lots of personal tragedies, and I just felt like it was unhealthy at a certain point for me to stay. But I love the city and I love visiting now.
Makes sense. I think Jeffrey says he has a question about powwows. You want to hop on?
Yeah.
You had mentioned something about like people getting interested in powwows rather than their traditional culture, and I've noticed there is a lot of interest in powwow culture, which is kind of pan-native. I mean, that's true across the U.S. But it seems like I don't know, it seems like there's a lot of Louisiana cultural forms that are similar to that seem to just really be very unrecognized native dancing, or like when we see like the outfits the Acadians wear at Mardi Gras, I'm thinking native regalia. When we see black masking Indians, I'd like to hear some of your thoughts on powwows here. And curiously enough, one of the last times I saw you, I think, was at the Tunica Biloxi powwow.
Yeah.
We met up with our friend John Barbary of the Tunica Biloxi Nation. I just kind of like to hear your thoughts on some of that, because it's such a common native expression here. There are several of them in the state, and yet it's also not really, I mean, it's funny that it's such a prominent expression since it's not really part of the cultures here. It was just kind of an interesting thing I wanted to hear you elaborate on.
Yeah, I think it's something that many tribes in the Gulf South have sort of like embraced, right, as a form of performative culture, as a form of sort of identifiable expression of culture. I don't know, even if it's not part of our, quote, traditional culture. I think that we had lots of gatherings, right? For hundreds and hundreds of years, millennia, if you want to say so, prior to the powwow. One of the really cool stories that I heard was about people from another tribe coming to play ball. And I heard that story. That story's been reported in my tribe many times. And when I was little, and I think probably many adults as well, felt like, oh, they must have meant softball, because, our people played baseball and softball a lot. But this was, around the turn of the beginning of the 20th century. And turns out, these are the last sort of remembrances of intertribal stickball games, right? People coming from far away, being fed, and games being played. And so, I think that many types of gatherings, including dancing, including music, including other things, predated the powwow. And those things, and those kind of things, mostly got lost. In my tribe, there was a really prolific tradition of fiddling, and that fiddling culture sort of, I don't know if it was just disregarded as non-native or something, but it's gone now. There's one guy who sometimes sets up and fiddles, but mostly plays with his kind of contemporary rock band at our powwow. But and the Puri family, some of them continue that on as musicians, but the old songs that they played are probably mostly lost. You know, that their parents and grandparents played. So I think that on one sense, there is a continuity. There is a whole tradition of many tribes throughout our state and region visiting with one another, having knowledge of one another, and doing things together from time to time. But powwow as such, yeah, probably not. But I think powwow as such is really not that old, right? There are elements of the powwow, there are dances of the powwow that are old, but the powwow in its sort of modern form is probably, yeah, not more than 100 or so years old. And so, and in the South, probably more like 50 or 60. And amongst the tribes in Louisiana, you know, sometimes like only 20 years or 25 years of that tradition. And so I think in some ways, I resented powwows. I resented powwows. The more I learned about my traditional culture, the more I resented powwows, because I felt like powwows take a lot of time, effort, space. People put a lot into them, and you know, why aren't we doing traditional dances? Why aren't we doing social dances? Why aren't we doing things more regularly? Yeah, in the circle, right? Even if it's not a powwow circle, right? And
Yeah.
so probably by, I don't know, 10 or 12 years ago, I got really resentful of powwows for some reason.
Yeah,
Because I saw them like that they're a kind of graft, a borrowed culture
it also seems to have a lot of American culture that's like
that have what? A lot of,
just American culture, the contests,
oh yeah, yes, just
the flag waving, especially in Louisiana, the intense Christian prayer, you know, like it's the adulation of American militarism, you know, like
yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, you can see, yeah, parts of parts of the Western rodeo, sort of, right? You know, in the powwow circuit, all of those kinds of things. It's a lot of it, I think, is contradictory. I don't necessarily think that the Christian prayer or, you know, waving of the flag is necessarily a quote artificial graft through the powwow onto my tribe. I think a lot of the majority of my tribe are, you know, consider themselves Christian and specifically Catholic, although that has changed in the past couple of decades. At one point, you probably could have almost taken a census of Catholic people in the region, and they would have been members of my tribe, you know, whereas all around them is primarily Anglo and Black Protestants, right? But, and also I think this sort of, you know, war valor and this idea of yeah, military nationalism exists in my tribe, regardless of the powwow, right? I mean, people talk about their ancestors fighting in World War I and II, especially World War II, and then many of our elders that are still with us served in Vietnam, regardless of you know, regardless of this, the whole purpose of that war. I mean, I think that people see them as being yeah, honorable, if not, you know, heroes, you know. And so there's a certain thing about being military vet, and I think that is reinforced. That sort of sense is very much reinforced in the gourd dancing that came south, right? That came from Comanches and Kiowas to the Gulf Coast, um, and so I think that within that society, which was, you know, a warrior society amongst the Omaha and amongst Kiowa and others, it sort of grafted onto a kind of military vet kind of uh, group within Gulf Coast tribes. And so I think that there's that. Um, I think it's tough because the powwow has a lot of different sort of social functions, if you will, right? It creates a place for us to visit one another. So that's awesome, right? Creates a space to discuss other forms of culture and traditional culture, um, and to do those things. It also exists sort of to some degree, I think, as a spectacle for the general public, right? Um, there are still Indians, and this is what they do. You know, they dance with feathers, and so there's that. Um, so I don't know. I no longer have a sort of hatred towards powwows. I've reluctantly at first joined a powwow committee at NSU, and being pulled along by some of my sisters like Elizabeth Parit and Tewani and uh, many others. So I jumped in and helped on that, and then after that, my tribe wanted me to join their powwow committee, so I've done that. Uh, but it is a contradictory space, and I think that that's even more exacerbated when you talk about prizes and bringing in dancers from farther and farther away. It has a certain role and function, but I wish that that could be balanced with more capacity building and um, more local social events.
I'm I'm wondering if you see a connection between, you know, when you're talking about powwows and what you liked and disliked about them and how they were a graft. I was also thinking about punk rock. Is there a way that you use punk rock to express yourself?
I would say not now, not so much. I mean,
Yeah.
occasionally I listen to punk rock, and I'm, you know, uh, amazed to hear about, the latest uh, Dene punk rock band or something like that, uh, but overall, I would say that that my angst and attitude and quest for knowledge and social justice and revolution even have not subsided, but my the depth and the time and commitment I once had to that form of music's no longer with me. Occasionally I'll listen to it for nostalgia or go to a show, but it's no longer a huge part of my identity because I think that for me at least, the liberatory aspects are outweighed by a lot of other junk that comes along with it. So,
What do you mean by that?
oh, um, if I were to have continued to put on shows, I would have wanted them to break even or make money, and then all of a sudden the money becomes more important, because it takes my time and all of that. And so I just rather be a occasional passive consumer or nostalgist for punk rock. Um, yeah, and I never had enough technical skill, even for punk rock. I kind of held a bass, and played along sometimes. when people needed a bassist, but it was basically mimicking a couple of easy guitar chords, not doing anything elaborate or even I don't know. I was dishonoring that instrument. That's what I was doing.
Ida wrote in the chat that farming is totally punk rock. Do you see that as a connection
Yeah,
there?
I think so. I think especially, small farmsteads are very much punk rock in the sense that doesn't really fit with mainstream, quote American culture and values. Although like farmers, even after the corporate consolidation of farms in the second half of the 20th century, I think people still sort of, idolize some mythic farmer. I think the idea of like actually growing vegetables and, having chickens and goats is, it's like, wow, what are you, crazy? I get my chicken from the grocery store, and why do you spend so much time on that? And it can't possibly be cheaper to produce a chicken than I can get it from the grocery store. And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, well, you can't even produce eggs like, cheaper than I can get the cage-free eggs at the grocery store. And I'm like, yeah, it's probably true too, but I still enjoy doing it. And it's good to know that the animals have a good life as well, not just sort of part of an organic part of the machine. It's just being pushed through the machine. And so I enjoy it. I think it's important to have relationships with the others, the ones that are not human, whether they're plant or two-legged or four-legged, whatever.
Mhm.
I don't really like the 100-legged ones, but
Agreed. I guess another thing is a question that I had is, I think we kind of touched on this, but what do you believe are the cultural practices that you engage in?
That's a great question, because I think there are things that it's easy to sort of like put into a box and say these are our traditional cultural practices, and I think it's also very easy to sort of valorize what you consider to be traditional cultural practices versus others. I don't know. I think culture, maybe training as an anthropologist, I don't know, like culture is constantly changing. And I think it's important to look and understand and learn our culture from our elders. And then after we do that, I think it's important to collectively discuss, if we're gonna change certain parts of our culture, why do we decide to bury this part of our culture or let it go back to the ancestors? There are certain parts of our culture that people insist are fundamental that that I might insist are really not. They might be traditional. They might be traditional for the past 150, 200 years of forced religion. They might be traditional in a sense, homophobia, sexism, right, racism, even these kind of things that might have predominated for a long time. I think it's important, it's healthy and important to discuss and to say these shouldn't be parts of our culture. These should not be hallmarks of our culture. So with all of that said, food obviously and foodways, I'm interested and want to document and continue elements of our traditional foodways. Maybe I'm totally wrong on this, but I believe that our community is the only one in the United States amongst Native communities that has both log mortar and matadi tradition. So we we do corn both ways, right? On a stone grinder, that's common in the Southwest in Mexico, where some of our ancestors came, um, as well as using log mortar. So we have corn foods that are both nixtamal, foods that are um, prepared traditionally with ash, and they go through that process like most corn is prepared in the Southwest and in Mexico and Central America. And then we have other hominy and other foods that are pounded more like cornmeal, like most of the tribes in the Southeast. And so I think that's a really interesting part. People don't use really the mataris or log mortars anymore. They use food processors, but still, some of these corn foods are live and some of them are not. And so I think that's interesting and maybe different. There's been a huge desire to get back to doing our traditional baskets. Mr. Tom Colvin has come to the community and helped reteach palmetto stalk and split cane basketry. And so my mother is one of his students. She finished her first basket last year doing that. Prior to that, there's a lot of interest in continuing the pine needle basketry, which people in my tribe do, and other tribes in Northwest Louisiana, and I think the Cosati and the Alabama probably are the most noted for doing those pine needle baskets, but we do those. Quilting, these kinds of traditional things. Hunting and fishing are still huge, absolutely huge in the community. Everyone's expected to hunt and fish, and that's not something that's based on gender or even really age. I mean, they're like 6-7-year-olds hunting and fishing all the time, in the community. There's far less commercial fishing now than there was when I was a boy or even before I was born. They say that when the Sabine River flowed regularly, there was lots and lots of commercial fishing going on amongst members of my tribe. Wild food gathering, I think, is making a comeback in the region. And all these kinds of traditional forms of culture, some of which hadn't been practiced in a generation or more, we're trying to recapture and to relearn, to reunite with. I'm part of a cultural group called the Jomenti Society, and so we're trying to just to kind of revive lots of that forms of traditional culture. I learned doing the Foodways book that there's some retention of some traditions in some families, and other families remember different things. Sometimes these things are even at odds, but I think it's important to share, right? To share that knowledge beyond the family level, so that our tribe as a whole can be healthy and happy. And so we have that cultural organization. If I were to describe to outsiders, what's the culture there, I would just say it's indigenous and it's unique. A lot of imprint sort of from the layers of colonization we've experienced. And I think, the Spanish imprint is the largest. Many of our surnames are very derived from Spanish surnames, given at baptism or married into our tribe. I think the culture of ranching sort of continues. There's a sort of vestige of a kind of cowboy culture that exists there. The foodways, completely unique. I think I found lots of analogs with other tribes, but I don't know another tribe that shares all of those, right? Because there's this fusion of Mexican and Southwest cooking styles with many of the seeds of the Southeast as well. And so um, uh, I think that there are, like I said, there are elements of the culture that exist as a living culture that I disagree with, right? And I disagree with sometimes with the elders who are the keepers of the knowledge of that, and that's tough, right? That's tough. That's tough when there are traditions that came from who knows where or from what tribe that gifted us with some knowledge, like, you know, that women aren't to sit at a powwow drum. You know, I hold difference with that, right? So that makes some elements of keeping culture, surviving culture, supporting traditional culture difficult, right?
What what do you see as your role within the community when you hold these differences?
Um, Trickster.
Okay, go on.
Yeah, I think it's important to sometimes play devil's advocate. I think it's sometimes absolutely important to ask questions that have no answer or to uh, the culture.
Hello? Oh, oh no, you're gone.
And knowledge should be to shelter the culture, to help it to continue to grow. It says my internet. So yeah, I was saying I think it's important. Although the majority of my efforts and time go into something like continuing cultural continuity or, you know, to catch the culture. One of the things that uh, really influenced me a lot was talking to a classmate of mine when I was living in Bobancha at the University of New Orleans. It was Donna Puri. And so Donna was in my anthro class and she described the Tunica Biloxi culture at length, and she inspired me because I felt so many similarities. You know, that tribe has Tunica, Biloxi, Ofo, Avoyelles, and Choctaw, and the language most commonly spoken other than English was French, right? And so there's a strong imprint of French colonization and the Catholic Church, and I saw a lot of parallels. And so she told me a story once, and I don't know who she got the story from. Maybe it was Chief Joe Puri, but you know, it was something like that. The culture is the last practitioners of the culture sort of throw a ball at the end of their life. If they can't pass the ball to a family member or a friend, it's just thrown into the air. And maybe if we're lucky, even over a whole generation, we can catch that ball, right? And so that was an interesting concept. And so I think a lot of the last 10 or 12, maybe even 15 years of my life has been trying to see if there are any more of those balls that are still in the air, and if they are, try to seek them out. Try to find people that almost caught one of those balls, you know, something like that. Cultural continuity, trying to figure out, like, you know, how can we essentially piece together what was left of our culture after it had been smashed into 1,000 bits by, you know, 400 years of colonization, 300 at least. But another part of me really, really just wants to play the trickster. I want to problematize our culture, our existing culture, as well as what we've been taught from our ancestors. I want to ask questions, sometimes questions that can't be answered and certainly can't be answered comfortably. So in that sense, that's what I meant by sometimes I see myself as a trickster. I definitely don't see myself as an authority. Um, I have a passion for learning. I want to learn more. I want to share what I've been told, but I don't see myself as authority as much as a trickster. And maybe in doing that, it can help other people be more sure about the elements of their culture. I mean, we have to make certain decisions, right? And that's true of every nation and every individual within every nation. Um, you know, my mother, for example, she loves doing Choctaw baskets. She has done Choctaw language on her own, and I think on the internet, and she feels really strong to that. But you know, my tribe's most recent living language, other than English, was this colonial Spanish trade language that's people know a few words from, but is almost completely gone. I think it's worthy to learn that, you know, despite it coming, its structure and everything coming from Europe, you know. I mean, the structure of the ribbon shirt came from Europe. Everybody loves those ribbon skirts, ribbon shirts. So I think it's also important to learn uh, Ende, and you know, to the extent that the tribe ever decides to have a language program, we have to make that decision, right? What language are we talking about, you know, and to what extent does making a choice of one negate the others? And that's really tough, because I think there's something important in that colonial Spanish trade language. I see that as an indigenous language, in fact, in addition to all of the other ones, right, that our ancestors spoke, Caddo dialects, Hadai, which we probably couldn't reconstruct because there are probably like 100 words that were ever, you know, from that. Mobilian trade jargon, right? Also spoken by our ancestors. So how, you know, these kind of questions about kind of, you know, bolstering our tribe and making it stronger involves a lot of tough questions. And I want to be the person who asks the tough questions, or to say, well, what about this? And sometimes sometimes that's an annoyance, right? That's annoyance to my sisters and brothers on council, right? It's just a complete annoyance. If I were on council, it'll be the same way. I was that person last time. But I think what's important is to not just be that person, right? Be the person also that's willing to do the hard work and not just say, you know, what about and what if. And so in that sense, maybe you know, I'm something else, but playing the trickster.
I'm thinking about the throwing of the balls and playing the trickster. I would definitely want to get back into your language work. But how much do you see? I also know that you recently graduated your PhD within the last few years. I'm wondering how your trickster role and your catching of the balls plays into what you research or your process as a scholar.
Yeah, so I think my process as a scholar is it's tough to unravel, but certainly is influenced in many ways uh, by my indigeneity, but also I would say my responsibility to my tribal community. Our previous chairman, Chief John Prosell, asked me, he said, when I finished with my other master, he said, we need you to write the true history of our tribe. And so I thought, oh, okay, yeah, 300 years of ethnohistory, I can just do that. And I looked around, I thought, well, I bet I could probably best do that as part of a dissertation. And I considered a lot of different programs, but I wound up going to UT Arlington in a transatlantic program, transatlantic history. And I thought that would be an interesting vantage point, rather than just American Indian history, or, you know, kind of the old borderlands history of the Southwest, to view the ethnohistory of our people. I got there, and like within a year, the only American Indianist that was in the program did an early retirement, and I wound up having to do something different. And that was great for me because I'm still working on that ethnohistory, and I hope to be able to be done with it in the next 2 to 3 years. But it was great for me because it allowed me to allow me the freedom to work on some other interests. And those interests primarily have to do with maps, and primarily have to do with maps created by Europeans and Euro-Americans of native spaces in North America. I've long been interested in this because of maps like Powell's map, or you know, you might be familiar with the Swanton map of the Gulf South, these kinds of maps. And I wondered, like, where does this information derive? Where does this sort of all of the cultural information that creates these boundaries on these maps come from, right? Are these boundaries native boundaries? What do these boundaries mean? And so I started sort of pulling at that piece of yarn, and the more I did, the more I was convinced that these kinds of ethnographic maps are based on a lot of Eurocentric suppositions, right, about what territory and territoriality mean. You know, largely intertwined with all these ideas from early German social science, right? The same kind of ideas that led to ideas like Lebensraum, and, you know, all kinds of crazy justifications, sometimes racial justifications for war, these kinds of things. And so I wanted to look at these maps critically, and to try and better understand where they come from. It's always struck me as strange that on certain maps, certain of my friends' tribes are placed in certain places, and sometimes other places. And then, you know, why is it that, for example, these Royce series of maps, you know, basically show Louisiana and Texas as being Louisiana and East Texas as being barren, basically because the United States claims no responsibility to the tribes of East Texas and Louisiana, because it says, oh, well, you know, the French and Spanish were there first. It was their problem. You know, despite the fact that the you know, Louisiana Purchase says quite clearly that the United States is supposed to continue to honor the treaties with the tribes, right, that were made by Spain and France before them. So, but so these kind of maps have really captured my attention, and I've spent a lot of time on them, and I'm convinced I can't make it a better map than them. I'm convinced that each nation, and sometimes even within nations, you know, each clan or even family has to create their own maps. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on with, you know, with open source and collaborative mapping these days. And I think there's going to be a possibility to do some interesting maps that have nuance, tension, and sometimes contradiction. But I don't claim to be able to create a better map than these maps. I just think it's important people understand you know, what's hidden just beneath the surface of these maps. You know, people somehow take maps as being sort of, oh, that's a thing, that's a reality, right? Whereas, you know, if it's a book, people are more likely to be critical of it. It's strange.
I'm wondering, I'm personally curious now to hear your thoughts on the Indigenous land map. I know that that's like an online website of an interactive map that shows language boundaries and treaty boundaries. I was surfing around it the other day, and it was interesting to see how few treaties you can see within the South Louisiana Gulf Coast area.
Right. So the I think that there's a great intention behind that specific open source map. You're talking about the indigenouslands.ca or something.
Yes.
Yeah. So that one, I think I really appreciate their. They might have one or two different disclaimers, right? That about that map. But I think it's very much from a Canadian state point of view, and so treaties are typically the numbered treaties for Canada. I think that those maps typically depend heavily on the same kind of maps that I'm interrogating, and I think this is true of a lot of different maps that are done by the Indigenous map makers as well. Like when you try to talk about a landmass as big as Turtle Island or larger, right? Like it's tough to have any kind of authority, let alone nuance, over so many different the traditional lands of so many different peoples. So I think being open source is fine. I think being able to trace the source of the contributions is absolutely important, and I think that a lot of micro level work needs to go alongside the sort of macro boundary and overlapping boundary work, right? So that would require a lot of time, effort, and I think that time and effort is onerous on all of Indigenous nations, but especially ones without federal acknowledgement or without even some that have federal acknowledgement, but very little resources, right, to do. And so then it just becomes a volunteer effort from either someone on a council or someone from a cultural department or just an individual that has some knowledge, right? And then, oh, well, Robert did something about the formation of our community in this year in this place, and suddenly, you know, half of the tribe's angry at me because what authority did I have to put that down? And so there's those kinds of questions, right? I don't think it's easy to solve. I'm glad that specific website exists despite its limitations. I think that people utilizing it as an entry point is great. I think that people just relying on it for land acknowledgements and kind of never thinking any more deeply about the polygon that's on the screen is irresponsible. Yeah.
Another thing that map tracks is languages, and I guess that was just kind of a segue, less about the map and more about your relationship with languages. And I also kind of want to thank you. I mean, if you weren't, you know, a butterfly in China type of thing, where if you weren't at University of Texas Arlington at the exact year you were, you may not have been on the board for the Colang 2014. And if you weren't there at Colang 2014, then maybe, you know, on that steering committee, you know, posters may not have been at LSU for that event. And then, you know, I would have never seen those posters and I would have never attended. So, you know, I owe the Homo Language Project, and I personally owe a lot to you being in University of Arlington and being part of that. So I appreciate that. So thank you. And then also I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how involved you are in languages and why and how.
Yeah, so that's a really tough question. So I'm working on a booklet, that is a kind of a portal or a non-authoritative beginning point for people who are interested in the languages of the ancestors of the Choctaw Apache community of the Barb. And so in that book or booklet, basically give an overview of things like Mobilian um, and the state of Lipan Apache as a language. And I give resources, both traditional texts, but also uh, contemporary language communities, intentional language communities that are learning together online, etc. Because at this point, my tribe doesn't have a language department. It doesn't even have a sort of formal cultural department. And so um, that that book would be, a handbook for people who want to learn more, because there's a huge thirst out there for knowledge. And some people, like I said, my mother, she's learning standardized Choctaw, and others are um, in a group learning Lipan Apache. Um, Other people want to know things about the Sabine River Spanish or colonial trade language. So I'm trying to compose a sort of a booklet that would be basically a pointer to those places, spaces, and texts. It could also be a maybe a foundational point for a language program in the future, right? Just one collective bibliography that the tribe could use if we're lucky enough to have someone like you that wants to do push forward a language program. Um, but I do recognize that that in doing a language program, that tough decisions have to be made, right? I don't want to make that decision, right? I don't want to be the elder of mine who in the 1970s said, okay, I'm inspired by uh, AIM, and I love that I'm native, and I'm going to go to Crow Dogs and learn all of these Lakota ceremonies. I'm also not going to be the one that says, that's not real Indian anyway. What we do is this, and our language is that, and we eat pork. I'm not trying to like be some caricature, or even stake out a permanent kind of position on these questions of language. I think for people to understand the diversity is an important first step, right? That's kind of my take on it. I don't know.
That's real. I'm thinking of, language is connected with community, and that kind of brings us to our next big part of, who do you see as your Indigenous community?
Yeah, so I think there are different ones that are overlapping, right? There's my tribe as a whole, and especially those cousins and friends and enemies, frenemies, who live in Sabine Parish, and I see that as being certainly the Choctaw Apache community, Barb community. Um my cousins and other kin who have moved away but maintain ties to that community and to my family through family reunions and powwow and other stuff. Um, I would say another community is this community that we created through Jomenti Society. We started the Jomenti Society because of we felt as though those of us who founded it felt as though that every election cycle in our tribe brings a lot of turmoil, and people, if they run for office or their friend loses for office, they might sort of drop out for a while of doing stuff, you know, um, with the tribal government. And so he said, no, we can't have this kind of constant disruptions. We, at least on cultural issues, we need to maintain a space that's sort of open and that has some continuity. You can't depend on the council, you know, the elected council to sort of have continuity when we know that every election cycle, every 3 years, you know, things can get tense and sometimes even bitter. And so we started this, some of us losers from an election cycle, along with others who try to be pragmatic, and started this group. And the idea is that everyone's welcome there if they want to learn, if they want to share, and everyone meaning members of the tribe who might feel disaffected from the government, from the tribal government. It also can include friends who are non-native but want to learn native culture, and many native friends from the region who found themselves in that area but aren't from that tribe. And so we do stuff together as a cultural organization. And that cultural organization has grown to include other acquaintances and friends that live farther away, farther and farther. Now there are members in as far as Central Texas and St. Tammany Parish. So so I really consider that to be a community. We do events and we do online discussions and things like that. And then I would say forward thinking or active people of Louisiana tribes. So the Wabancha Collective, you know, I feel a strong affinity for, yeah, for all the stuff that you all are doing, and initiatives amongst natives in Louisiana that want to do stuff, right? Like, I think for me, it's important to have those multiple spaces, you know, not just sort of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association space, right, for sort of Native academics, but also practitioners of traditional culture who want to share that culture, right, in our state. And so I see that, you know, multiple sort of overlapping Venn diagrams. What I might consider my community, I don't know. It's growing. There are members of Louisiana tribes that live in Alaska and Massachusetts who I feel like is part of my community, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. I know we're running close on our 2 hours, and I want to make sure that Jeffrey and Ida have time to ask questions, but I have a few more.
Oh gosh, I don't even feel like we got anything meaty yet.
I know.
Oh, there's plenty of meat.
There's meat coming.
Red hot meat.
Are you often asked? So part of this project is you know, doing an AMA for people who may not get a chance to talk with Robert Caldwell about these things. And so I'm trying to think of like a general audience for this, and what they may have interest in. And I'm wondering, how often do you get asked to talk about your Indigenous background?
Every November.
Remember?
But seriously, I think it's probably about 60 or 70% being asked to talk about some aspect of Native identity or culture or history, and probably 30%, you know, talk about my personal experiences, etc. And so I think that This is too common, you know, where some individuals expected to be the sort of mouthpiece of a broader group. And um, I think for me, it's important to be part of a broader group, right? To be connected to the broader group, but I'm not the spokesperson for that broader group unless they say so, right? And so when I was a delegate to the National Congress of American Indians and an alternate, then I was a spokesperson for my tribe. And I was careful what I said, and I said things that would reflect positively on my tribe and what we were trying to accomplish politically. But today I'm speaking as myself, and I mean, even if I'm speaking for a broader collective, it's still going to reflect my personality and idiosyncrasies and all that. And so, um, yeah, there's some level of discomfort, right, of being that person that's singled out. You know, you hate being in a situation where, you know, your friend is the only African American in a small group, and they're constantly the teachers constantly asking them or looking at them for answers about, you know, race or experience of African Americans. And I think the same is true for natives, like maybe even more so. Um, you know, the idea that we're somehow, you know, this rarity, and you know, they found us, and so therefore we can speak to some experience. We can speak to our experience, right? And our experience is hopefully um, legible, understandable to other members of our collectives. But I know for sure that there are many people that are great speakers about my tribe's culture who can lay it out far more clearly, right? And are far more knowledgeable about it than me. And so, um, it's this tough catch-22, because you want to share, you want to let people know that your culture is alive and is thriving and is in many ways uh, trying to build towards more trying to exercise sovereignty, right? But on the other hand, you know that you're limited just being one person. So I think that there's going to always be a tension there, at least if one's thoughtful and hasn't sort of worked out some kind of spiel, some kind of pre-formulated, you know, this is what I'm going to talk about.
Yeah.
I don't do that. Even when I write speeches or answers to these kinds of questions in advance, I always go off the script. That's part of being that trickster, I guess.
You know, as Robert Caldwell, the individual, what are things that you feel comfortable and excited about talking, topics that you feel excited and want to talk about if you were given the opportunity?
So I want to talk about, I feel excited talking about historical experiences, especially those without many people or any people that have living memory of them. And I feel really, really excited talking about kind of restorative practices and new projects. I feel very, very, very uncomfortable talking about 1945 until 1970 or something, because there are people who are alive that had that experience of those years, who I would think are much better to talk about that experience. If someone really wanted to know about something that happened in those years, I would try and find 3 elders that can tell their different experiences and then maybe synthesize something from them. But it might not even be possible, because there are a lot of shared experiences, right? Darker skinned members of our tribe experiencing violent racism, the flooding of Sabine River to create Toledo Bend, which is a traumatic experience for many of our elders. But then there are many things that are tied up in personal experiences, like, oh, and I lived there until 1960, whatever, and then I went and worked in the Texas oil fields, or some elder might have married someone from the military and moved to the north or something like that. Who knows? But I don't know. Maybe I diverged too much, but I really enjoy talking about the what ifs of history. I think when I try and think about what practices from the past that we can reinstitute, I guess I go into native futurism sometimes, because I know that we can't go to some golden past. We have to build a future that is based on what we want it to be and what we can make out of what we have, out of the materials we have.
Yeah, I have this one question that's still in the back of my mind that you mentioned very early in the interview. Was you mentioned that your father's experience was a lot different than your mother's experience. And I'm thinking about how involved you are with Foodways and like the traditional, makers of food. I'm wondering if you can tell a little bit more about your mother's experience and talk about that.
About my father's or my mother's?
Mother's.
Oh,
Yeah.
So, well, my mom, I think she moved around a lot because her stepdad was in the Air Force, and so her luckily she was able to spend lots of the summers with my great grandfather, and so she soaked that knowledge up, I think, even more than her own mother and many of her aunts and uncles, and so I'm very grateful for that, and she's very grateful for that, and so much, I think, like, there's a lot of nostalgia built up around that relationship. She had lived probably until the late 90s in Shreveport area, and when it became possible to acquire the land that my great grandparents lived on, she moved there and lived in a little trailer there for a while. And then by happenstance, the Catholic Church in the area, the one that my great grandparents attended, they wanted to get rid of a building that the nuns used to live in, the nuns that taught at the Catholic school there. And so she was able to move that building onto her land. And it's interesting, older family members will talk about, oh, I got paddled in this room or whatever, that's not a good memory. But it's, for her, I think it's good because it's tied into our family. And I think also, yes, service to the church, because my mother's not an avid churchgoer. But her grandparents were, and she has a sort of respect for that, even though she's not an avid churchgoer. So,
Yeah.
So her reestablishing herself probably in the late 90s, mid to late 90s on her grandparents' land, I think probably, I don't know, it activated her need or want or desire or proclivity towards all of these things, right, that she was taught as a young child. And I try and get her to share those things. Sometimes she shares them with me, and she shares them in Jomenti Society meetings now, but she would probably be happy just to do them as part of her daily life, right, and not share. And so sometimes she doesn't even necessarily recognize that, oh, well, this is something that's inherently indigenous or something. It's just like, oh, this is something my grandfather taught me. So I don't know if that answers your question about my mom.
Yeah, no, it does. I think that was the last of the questions that that I have for now. I wanted to open it up to Ida and Jeffrey to see if they had any questions they wanted to ask. Anyone? Questions?
Nope.
Sorry, I was on mute. Robert, I wanted to ask you something, probably because I'm also a Native person with a PhD. And I think there's people often talk about the tension between Native scholars who look at an issue versus white scholars looking at the same thing, and the difference in lens of interpretation and perspective, et cetera, especially in certain disciplines that are really calcified. It seems like, just as an example, there was an article published by the Smithsonian in 2006 that said my tribe didn't exist. And I have a whole play I'm writing now where part of it, the ghost of one of our chiefs goes on a rant about the Smithsonian not having an internet connection. And, like things like that. But there also sometimes a tension between the scholars and the community as a whole. And I started thinking about this when I lived in Boulder, Colorado, and I had this friend in the linguistics department. He's a white guy from Louisiana that I just kind of became friends with. And he'd gone with me to a couple of powwows, been to parties at my house and stuff. And they asked me a weird question. He said, like, every Native person I meet is like a PhD, a grad student, a cultural leader, an artist. And he said, like, where are your dumb people? And I was like, what do you mean? It's like, well, like, obviously they're he's Cajun. He's like, there are Cajun artists, Cajun scholars, but we also have just like regular Cajun bumpkins. We have like people who don't care one way or the other about learning anything new. Like, and he's like, it's weird because like, I feel like I never meet like non-scholarly, non-professional Native people around here, which is partially due to the fact that he was not meeting me in Louisiana. I guess was part of it.
Yeah, right.
But it does speak, like, and he didn't mean like, he meant it really well what he was asking me. But do you feel any tension between that in terms of identity of your inclusion in the group of Native scholars versus your inclusion in the total group of Native people? And I'm not privileging Western type scholarly credentials over any other type of knowledge. I'm just interesting to hear your take on that. Or when you are doing scholarly work, do you feel your audience is your people as a whole, or much more the larger scholarly community, the Native scholarly community? It's something I think about a lot, and I'm not even sure I'm asking the question correctly, but maybe you can touch on some of those issues.
Yeah, I think this sort of like dovetails with this earlier question about what are your communities. And for me, I think being a Native scholar means having a lot of responsibility, right? Responsibility to those communities. And I think that there's an inherent tug in many directions, right? From the academic community, from Native scholars, right? And for me, there's also a tug from my tribal community. A good example of this is, the people who aren't scholars, who might not be the best speaking in front of groups either, are the people who I got the information for to create my Choctaw Apache Foodways, right? They are the practitioners. I received an award from the Lieutenant Governor, for being a traditional cultural practitioner, but the award's not to me. The award is to all of those people, all of the elders, all of the tribal members who told me what I know. Few of them would probably ever be interested in writing an academic article. So when I finished the book, or as I was writing the book, in fact, I had a number of discussions with Texas A&M Press, Oklahoma Press. Oklahoma wanted me to double the page length and cut the pictures. And I was just like, no, the purpose of this book, the audience of this book is this community. My great-grandfather, who this book is dedicated to, could speak 3 languages, but he could not read or write, right, in any of them. So I want something that can engage people on many different levels, can engage through the photos, can engage through the family stories, the personal recollections, even through the recipes, right? I wrote a food book that was more about food and culture, but I included recipes because I wanted to be relevant, right? Someone's Mima or, great aunt who her auntie just passed away and we don't have that recipe. Well, it was preserved in Robert's book, right? And so I wanted it to be relevant. I have a responsibility. I still have a responsibility, not for my ego, but to the community to write that, to write our history, our ethno-history. At the same time, I do write academic articles. I think it's important that there are people from my tribe writing about my tribe in a scholarly fashion. I think that also creates tools for us to use in the future, right? I in some sense see myself as a tool, but also the things that I produce hopefully will be beneficial to the tribe as well, and might, gain the interests of others, whether it be from our specific case study and that we do exist, or even on methodological questions. It's there is a tension, and I think for me, I try and make sure that what I'm saying makes sense to the audience, that it doesn't go over their head. But I also don't want to use small words necessarily, or, in any way make it so that, that it has less sort of specificity or academic rigor. I want my stuff to be accessible. I know it's not always. I know that sometimes the way I talk makes it difficult. And when I'm talking to family and friends one-on-one, sometimes I'll break it down a little bit. And I can see, if I break it down just a little bit, it's like there's a whole new basis for further conversation. And then I learn more from it, right? I learned from them that I should have explained it in a different way. So, some of the people that some people might think are bumpkins or, uneducated are my greatest teachers, both because they have the knowledge, but also because they teach me how to explain things in a way that people understand, and not just in a way that I was trained to do at university.
I'd like to ask you a couple of more food-related questions. One involves tamales. So up near where the Choctaw Apache tribe of Ibarb, your sort of central zone, there is a tamale festival. The tamales are well known there. And I'm thinking about this also in relation to the Mississippi Choctaw. But every once in a while, I read an article by someone who will say like, wow, tamales are really popular in Mississippi. We don't know the origin of how these Mexican dish became popular here. Or they'll say like, wow, like they must be doing some sort of major cultural appreciation up in Zwolle, Louisiana, or in the Tamale Fest here in Bobancha, because they're just taking a Mexican dish. And they seem like, that isn't the tamale, like, that's not from somewhere else, right? Like it's a dish that is indigenous to this area, not just to Mexico, right?
True. Um, Mexico, Central America, parts of South America, and most of North America. Something like tamales, something like corn um, in the husk or shuck uh, of corn has existed throughout most of North America historically, and you see this. You know, if you read the words of the colonizers, right? Um, the English, when they came to Virginia, they saw these kinds of shuck breads. Um, the Mississippi Choctaw have banaja, um, uh, and tamales are ubiquitous throughout Mexico. Um, some of the earliest writings of the French in the Red River region, mention getting tamales from Caddo Chief when they visited, and so it's clear to me that something like tamales has existed in East Texas, Northwest Louisiana, um, you know, predating probably predating the 1500s. I don't know how long, um, and I don't know to what extent these things traveled along ancient indigenous trade routes. But what I can say is that the Choctaw Apache community has had tamales um, since the historic tribes that make us up have fused together with Spanish soldier settlers, a lot who were mestizos from Mexico, from French traders. But I think that this kind of food was a very common food throughout North America. Um, there's a lot of discussion amongst the community and scholars to what extent did the tamale making tradition come from interior Mexico, from Saltillo, Zacatecas, etc., up to the Spanish Presidio versus how much um, was already here. But I think probably both are true. I think that there was probably some um, familiarity already with tamales from Mexico, and there were already Caddos and others in the region making tamales before Europeans came. Um, the tamale fiesta, however, is it's a specific event that uh, yeah, it deserves interrogation on its own. I once thought of writing a mini ethnography called Mexican for a Day, because the local tourist bureau and those who see it as a money-making thing try to push these kind of Mexican motif onto the festival.
Do you, um, one of the things I've noticed a good bit, and this is perhaps because my tribe is a heavy contributor to the cuisine people call Acadian or Cajun or whatnot, is that there are things that are, like, I'm gonna say this. There's an indigenous diner I like to eat in Mexico, in Denver, called Tecapi, and someone once asked, why don't you start a restaurant like that here? And I said, like, how could you tell? Like, it seems like so much of the foodways of Louisiana are so heavily indigenous. Do you ever struggle with trying to get people to recognize that, or do you ever get pushback from
Yeah,
people who just
absolutely. And I would say even foods that are even fairly peculiar to the region, like people might not know that they can't get them from outside the region, but they might not, identify them as indigenous per se, right? And these are members of my own tribe who cook these foods, right? They know that it's their foods, but it's this sense of inside the community versus outside. more than sort of indigenous versus not or something.
Can you
right?
give some
So,
examples of that?
what's that?
Can you give some examples of that?
Yeah. So I think pepper foods is a big one. We have lots of pepper foods, some of which are similar to salsas and some which are very, very different. Um, Both from fresh chili peppers and from dried ones. So there are um, all kinds of different dishes, but the one that people like the most as a condiment and also as a sort of uh, uh, element of the meal, people mostly now just call pepper. And this is typically very spicy pepper with garlic, sometimes onions, sometimes tomatoes, and usually some egg. The egg kind of tempers the spice of the pepper somewhat, and people will often make a big batch of that and can it and eat it as a daily food and or condiment. And they know that they really can't get that outside in that way outside of Saving Parish at all. But I don't think they necessarily identified it as indigenous. Um, uh, there are lots of other local recipes, some of which anyone in Louisiana would be familiar with, but there's a one eating practice that's really, really heavily internally discussed, which is turtle, and these very large turtles that are usually made with like a, I don't know, you would call it a sauce piquant or something. Um, and that kind of turtle might be recognizable in other parts of Louisiana, but not really much further west than the river. And so people, will go over to Texas and they won't necessarily find that food.
Thank you for that answer, because I don't know, it gives me a lot to think about. Just as a bit of curious linguistic stuff, which I mean, is that in Ishikoi, the word for corn is so'ots, which is a word that comes from central Mexico. So why is that? No one knows, but yeah, clues. All right, thank you, Robert. I don't have any further questions, but I definitely really appreciate just listening to you talk. It's been a real treasure. Great experience.
Well, I appreciate talking to you all, and I hope you're able to make something, legible out of all this.
I think
I have
so.
another question.
Oh yeah.
What when you're thinking about yourself, or is there an audience that you hope to reach that you haven't quite yet?
Yeah, I want to reach all of me's when I was like, 8 or 9.
Mm-hmm. Knees? I'm sorry.
All of the little me's,
Okay.
whether the me's are a they or a she or a him. I mean, all of the younger members of the tribe, people who might not feel connected to their historical culture or might just be so frustrated where they're living right now, even if it's in the community, that they don't prioritize learning what's possible and to channel their hopes, dreams, rage, and everything else through building a stronger and healthier and more functioning tribe. I don't know. That's who I want to speak to. And I know that my language might not be the language for them. I don't know. Others I want to speak to is I think maybe I want to speak to my elders and to give them thanks for what they've given and also to tell them it's okay that maybe they didn't learn everything from their parents or grandparents, because it's not always potential learners' fault that they didn't learn. Sometimes knowledge was purposefully hidden. And I know that there are a lot of people my grandparents' age who wish they would have learned elements of the language or learned the language and didn't. That wish that they learned about other social and cultural practices but didn't. They were swept up in a generation that thought modernity and being indigenous were counterposed. And so sometimes I want to talk to them, and I want to talk to their parents too. I want to talk to all of those ancestors. But really, I think, it's cliche, but I want to talk to anybody my age or younger. I want to talk to anybody that'll listen. Because I feel like there are lifetimes of work to be done, but the results hopefully will be worth the intentionality.
What's your what gives you hope?
What gives me hope? I think that maybe I'm being too dramatic, but I think that there's an indigenous turn, right? Something hopefully even much beyond the sort of liberal sympathies for indigenous peoples of the 1960s and 70s, something much bigger than that, right? That is a turn for the earth, not just in, what the lands the United States claims, not just here. I think this indigenous turn there's a growing indigenous sort of sense of self in Mexico. I think certainly in the Canadian state, I both believe in something like a global indigeneity, and I think it's important to center myself, in my own tribe and in my region and with that of my closer cousins. So, but I do think that there's something like an indigenous turn. I think that people and the earth need that. I don't know. So there's lots to be pessimistic about in the world today, but I think that I see glimmers of this indigenous turn, and like Rage Against the Machine said, it's coming back around again. It's for the people of the sun.
Right on. Mic drop.